Welcome to our initial discussion of classical liberalism and public education for ES 490. This is in conjunction with Chapter 2 in the Tozer book, School and Society. So, starting off with classical liberalism, the framework here is very important. Classical liberalism is basically the overarching ideology that many people in colonial times utilized to explain the world, to make sense of their political, social, economic, and even spiritual context. So in understanding the logic of classical liberalism, quite often we understand the logic behind many of the decisions that were being made at the time. So ideology, however, does not take place without a context. So we're going to start by looking at the context that is surrounding the idea to see how there's interplay between the idea and the context. So for early U.S. education, first we have to acknowledge the strong Protestant influence on social and political life, as well as economic life. The majority of colonists in the early United States were from Britain, about 70% in fact, and many of them were Protestant. And so that cultural hegemony, meaning that cultural just deeply embedded dominance, pervaded many aspects of U.S. society, including education. So for many of the early decision makers about public schools, they basically felt that being a moral person was the same thing as being a Protestant. They didn't see it as a sectarian choice. They just saw it as being a decent person. So to them, ethics and Protestantism were pretty much the same thing. The other thing that we have to understand about that early context is that the economy is mostly an agricultural and trade-based economy at this time period. There's not a lot of industrialization. So for a lot of early colonists, they're either farmers or they're laborers for other people, or they're servants, or they're in trade in city. But what this means is that they're a lot of times limited to a local context. And this is true not only because of the economy, but because of the technology at the time. So there wasn't the same kind of infrastructure. There weren't trains or airplanes or cars. People didn't have telephones, telegraphs, none of that. So communication is very slow, very irregular. Traveling very far distances isn't necessarily usual or even desirable. And we also have to keep in mind that a lot of people in the early times in the country, they had just gotten through fighting a revolution against a strong central government in the form of a king. So many of them were very wary and suspicious of setting up a new form of central government for the early United States. So for all of those reasons, as well as just the unwillingness or maybe even the inability to pay taxes for federal government functions, a lot of people were still looking at schools and other institutions at a local level that was considered more desirable. So the other part that quite often we don't talk about in just regular generalized history of the United States, but that's very important, is that there are huge gaps in wealth during this time between people of European descent, who are basically the people who have access to public school at this time. So when we go back to that second point, that a lot of people are farmers, the ability to own your own land and earn money as opposed to being a wage earner with no property dependent on someone else is a big deal. There are a lot of people who are what they call, landless, the giddy multitude, as Howard Zinn quoted them. Basically people with not a lot of stability or security, and people who are also really overt in saying, look, we just fought this revolution for so-called freedom, and we still have these huge inequalities. So there's a big contradiction in the theory behind this new nation and our actual lived experience as members of this new nation. So there's a tremendous amount of tension that deciding elites are very aware of and are very desirable of stabilizing, mostly to protect their own wealth and interests, but also to protect the survival of the new nation. So along with that idea, that there's huge inequality, there's a lot of instability, but that elites would really like to stabilize things. There's also a lot of tension between this idea of freedom and the strong desire for order. So what that means is that people like Thomas Jefferson, for example, are saying if you just teach people how to be critical and understand their own interests, they will make good choices. And if they do that collectively, we will have a strong citizenry that's able to maintain itself and have a strong nation. Other people, like Benjamin Rush or Noah Webster, are saying, look, their interests and our interests are not exactly the same thing. So if they're sitting there thinking what's good for us, that may or may not include supporting the new nation. That may or may not include supporting the status quo. What might end up happening actually is that we have a complete economic restructuring and lose a lot of political power to all these landless masses and these wage-earning people, these disenfranchised. So what we need to do is use schools to socialize people to just obey the law, work hard, defer gratification, that kind of thing. And what that'll do is it'll really individualize this idea of equality as something that you just kind of earn through your own effort, and that'll create a stabilizing force. So there's a lot of tension, a lot of confusion during this time period, and that's part of the context. A lot of the different ways in which these early political elites are understanding these tensions comes through that lens then of classical liberalism, particularly around this idea of who is fit to rule. So they're employing an ideology to say, well, you clearly lack the ability to make decisions about your own life, therefore we deserve to make decisions for you. A lot of times that coincides very deeply with race, gender, economic status, even religion, especially in terms of Catholics, language. So overall, if you're able in this time period to portray someone as not capable intellectually of making good decisions, then you can disenfranchise them from political life by saying, we are more capable of making good choices than you are. So part of this other context that's economic, social, and political all together is to recognize that slavery is legal during this time period, and that a lot of people, such as Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, our so-called founding fathers, were also slave owners and people who had a very personal and public vested interest in maintaining this institution. Even if, as Jefferson did, they may agonize or waffle back and forth, ultimately their behavior supported the institution of slavery. And that this was an important political and economic issue in the North as well as in the South. The economy of slavery was very embedded in the North as much as the South. So this was not just a Southern problem, but a national problem. Similarly, this new nation was not necessarily just magically created from nowhere. There were people who were already there. And so the question becomes, what is the colonist relationship with indigenous people, with tribal nations? How do they obtain the land that everybody is farming? How are they creating spaces for themselves and generating wealth in land that they do not have a right to? So Indian removal and pushing people from land, the genocide, the violence, the deliberate causation of disease, the using of colonists to occupy land and just say possession is 9/10 of the law, all of that is happening at this time as part of the ongoing effort to expand U.S. territory. And so both of these institutions, basically anti-Indian genocide and slavery, they very much contribute to the overall racial construction of citizenship and American. In other words, in the early days of the U.S., we see very clearly that being American and being white are pretty much considered the same thing, and that the law is very active in constructing this idea of whiteness, of saying you are white, you are not white, therefore you have a citizen access to citizenship, you do not. You can vote, you cannot. You are able to be owned, you are able to own yourself. So the stakes are very high around the racial construction of whiteness and Americanness at this time, and have very strong economic, political, and social repercussions, many of which that we still live with today. So if you kind of need a visual, which I find is often helpful, one of the things we can do is just see all these relationships. Um, we can see that slavery is a big part of the U.S. economy. Indian removal also supports that, as well as trade and agriculture. And if you think of it like this, you can think, okay, when you expand slavery, you're expanding free exploited labor on land. Well, where do you get that land to expand into by Indian removal? What do you do with the crops that you have generated through that expansion of slavery, through that expansion of Indian removal and genocide? Well, that becomes articles of trade, articles of export. So those three areas are very much intertwined um, within the economy. And then Jefferson also had this idea of how to stabilize the economic inequality, which was also tied to Indian removal, and to agriculture, which is this idea of a yeoman farmer. So basically, what he's saying is if you take people who are just dependent on wages and you make them economically independent by giving them a small chunk of land, letting them farm, working hard, deferring gratification, building themselves up in their personal wealth, that's going to create stability across the nation because we won't have such huge inequalities in wealth. They're also going to have a different kind of investment in maintaining the national order. And of course, he's thinking of white yeoman farmers in this context.